Coming up on tonight's episode of Faith versus Culture, Sound of Freedom is soaring at the box office. We're going to discuss why coming up tonight.
To have sex before you marry is a bad idea.
Don't tell me there's no such thing as gun violence.
That just depends on your definition of when life begins.
There are problems of sin and habit that cannot be solved outside the person of our Lord Jesus Christ.
Well, hello and welcome to this episode of Faith versus Culture right here on the CBN News Channel. My name is Dan Andros, joined today by Tré Goins-Phillips and Billy Hallowell. Gentlemen, how's it going?
Hey.
Doing well.
Well, we're going to be talking Sound of Freedom today and all the issues surrounding it. There's been a lot of debate about this film, but I also wanted to get into today about how this is a thing, sex trafficking that is, particularly with kids, but in general. How is this a thing in the 21st century? It seems like it should be something that is relegated to third world countries, but it happens here in America, as we've seen, and around the globe, of course. So we're going to dive in, though, and talk about the film because it doesn't seem like one, guys, that should really be, it should be more of a uniting film. Like, hey, let's all fight this issue. Why do you guys think it's becoming so divisive?
You know, I think because we live in a very chaotic time where everything is divisive, right? But I do think it's troubling in that you have a situation where it's a very rare moment where you have a topic that every other movie and documentary that has covered this has really struggled to gain ground, right? And now you have a movie that not only has gained ground, it's broken a record. It's, exceeded over $125 million in box office revenue. And you have this perfect moment where you can get people to pay attention, and the media are, some of them, not all, are deciding to instead go out of their way to try to get people not to watch it with the way that they're covering it. That's the really heartbreaking part of this. And I think there are a lot of different theories as to why, but we've made our lives in this country in a way in which we can no longer have nice things. And I think this is an example of that. It's like, let's ruin everything and make it political and get clicks, right? But I will say, I think what's happening is the opposite effect. I think it's actually making people want to see the movie more, to be honest.
Yeah, I went and saw it. Its opening day was July 4th. I think it was the end of that week when I went and saw it in theaters. And I remember I live in Central Virginia, and this is a college town where I live. Liberty University is here, so there's a lot of college students who are at theaters all the time. But it was notably fuller than it had been for a lot of movies that I'd seen. And I talked to some other people who'd said, yeah, they've been selling out all the auditoriums for this movie. So I think we're at a point to what you were saying, Billy, where people are so desperate and hungry for truth, and they're willing to push back against the media narrative. And we have to remember that this is a movie that has been done since 2018. So it's been sitting on a shelf for 5 years, distribution rights owned by 20th Century, then ultimately Disney. And it just got the green light this year to finally, go out and obviously be in theaters. So I think there's a whole lot of media stuff, whether it's on the entertainment side or the news side, that's been fighting against this from day one. And the fact that it's still continuing to succeed and even outperforming all of the expected metrics, I think does show that people are really, really, really desperate, not just for truth, but for something that's hopeful, right?
Yeah. And, you look at that point, Tré, about it being made since 2018. I didn't know that when it first came out, and I heard that after I had already seen the film. And I just thought, wow, regardless of whatever you think on this topic, whether you think it's completely made up or not, which it's not, I'm just saying the point is this was a good film. And anybody with eyes watching it would know that this was a good film. Forget about any politics, forget about anything else. So it really makes you wonder, why in the world would they shelf it? I can't figure that one out.
Well, it's funny. I just actually talked not too long ago with Tim Ballard, who's the subject of the film, and I asked him about that, because I was curious, why he thought that was the case. And he didn't really have any answers, but he talked about the fact that it was shelved, and that after they went to Disney because Disney bought Fox, as Tré was saying, and they said, what's the issue? Why don't you want it? And they kept saying, it's not for us. It's just not for us. And what's so disturbing is that after Disney, they shopped it to all the other streamers, everybody else, and they also rejected it, right? So in order for this film to go independent, it had been brought to all of the mainstream, and they all said the same thing. And to your point, it's not like this was a crummy movie made with somebody's handycam in their backyard. This is a movie that's really well done. And so, yeah, there's no answers to that. I'm sure Disney, they've got to be kicking themselves now. Of course, they make a lot of big movies and they bring in a lot of money, but $125 million is nothing to, on a, $18 million budget. It's pretty impressive.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I'll just throw in here, Tré, before you go. I think another thing that happens, we're so tribal now, it's sad, but the country has just gotten to this point, whether it's social media's fault or whatever, where you kind of say, I'm in this tribe, and whatever things my tribe is mad about, I'll just go along and be mad about it, or I'll cheer about it. And all of us have known Tim Ballard and of his group, Operation Underground Railroad, for some time now. As having worked previously, full disclosure, for Glenn Beck and the Blaze, Glenn was the first one to have him on. And so when people saw that connection, I can't help but think, guys, that they said, oh, Glenn Beck, he's this conservative talker and opinion guy, and so therefore we should hate anything he does. It really reeks of that to me, because there's really no reason to be against what he's doing other than that.
Yeah, no, I agree completely. And the only thing that I was going to throw in there is the movie was made, Sound of Freedom was made on a $14.5 million budget. On its opening day, it earned $14.2 million. And I think the funny irony here is that on opening day, just the day, it beat the Disney movie Indiana Jones, which Disney had shelved the movie. So it's their fault. They could have been making all this money, and an independent studio ended up making all this money and even beat the Disney movie for one day, obviously. But that's still a
huge.
big deal and is noteworthy. But I think, yeah, Dan, to your point, this is the culture that we've created. It's something you were referencing earlier, Billy, which is that before we even give something a minute to actually see it and understand it and digest something, we've already been taught, because of social media, because of the algorithms that are fed to us, what we see, the content that we consume all the time. We know that if it's Glenn Beck or if it's in any way Christian, it's bad. And if it's the other way, if it's something from the secular world, I think often even as Christians, where our knee-jerk reaction is it's terrible, because we've been taught to live in those two silos. When in reality, a lot of times there's some truth and value somewhere in the in-between space.
Yeah, well, even if you don't like Tim Ballard, even if you have questions about how he's done some of his raids, even if you don't like Jim Caviezel and you think he's QAnon and you have all these concerns, the movie on its own should be the movie on its own. It speaks for itself. And that's the thing for me that's been so hard. You don't see outlets running with, Scientology, aligned Tom Cruise movie, or you don't see movies are not being judged based on their actors. If anything, Hollywood looks past everybody else's bad behavior. And so that part has been strange to watch. But I will tell you, as Dan mentioned, I met Tim Ballard 10 years ago. I became friends with Tim. I can tell you this, I can't speak to anything else outside of his passion for this issue. I believe is real based on conversations I've had with him, knowing who he was then. And so I think this is a person who cares a lot about this issue of trafficking and is trying to bring attention to it. And so to me, I don't know. And I also want to just say, I think there's a spiritual element to this. We're talking about the practical elements of this. There's a very real spiritual element, I think, that wants to diminish and downplay these sorts of things to take attention away from the fact that this is real and it does happen. And I think we have to acknowledge that.
Yeah, indeed. And also, too, guys, we can't ignore the fact that we're living in a culture that's currently trying to sexualize kids. I mean, let's not diminish that, right? We're seeing drag queens dancing. They're trying to involve kids into this, and it's disturbing. And so then you at the same time have what seems to be Hollywood saying, no, we don't want to talk about this and fighting this sex trafficking, or it doesn't exist. And so I don't know what the connection is there, but I don't like that both of those things are happening at the same time. But we're going to take a quick break here. We're out of time in the first break. We're going to continue this conversation. We're also going to talk about how, as Christians, we can engage to help, because why are so many people being driven into this industry in the first place, and how faith and Christianity can play a role in helping to stop that. We'll cover that and more coming up on the other side of the break. This is Faith versus Culture. All right, we're back on this episode of Faith versus Culture. Dan Andros, joined by Tré Goins-Phillips and Billy Hallowell, all of us from CBN Digital. And if you'd like to hear us talk about the news of the day some more, don't forget to subscribe and follow the Quick Start podcast every weekday morning at 7 a.m. We're going through the news of the day, and we'd love to have you there with us. We're talking about Sound of Freedom right now. And why is this thing a controversy? That's what we covered in the last break. But guys, I want to move into the issue of trafficking itself, because there are a lot of people who just can't believe it exists, but as it's been well documented, it clearly does. And our own Tara Mergener from CBN earlier this year, she did it was an eye-opening report. You can see it on the CBN News YouTube channel. And she did a ride along in Waco, Texas there. And basically there were these sting operations that they're doing and conducting. And what they find in this ride along and this walk along and following is just, it's shocking. It's everyday people that you would not suspect at all that are trying to solicit for sex, oftentimes with minors. And honestly, guys, the most shocking thing was he posed at one point as a parent in a chat room, and apparently this happens a lot, where parents are offering the services of their own children. And there were people, I mean, there must have been hundreds of messages that he got when he put this fake ad up. And that to me just was incredibly disturbing, incredibly shocking. But you see how people are lured into this, guys. And what can we do to prevent people from being in a position to where they are vulnerable to being lured into this awful trafficking industry?
Yeah, and I think that's the key question. The big thing, I think the first step is education and awareness, right? And that's where Sound of Freedom comes in. That's where Tara's report comes in, making people aware that this is a reality, that, according to estimates in 2021 alone, there were almost 28 million people in some form of forced labor, right? Whether that was, by the state, there's certain governments that force people into labor, whether that was sex trafficking. I mean, that is insane that 28 million people around the world are facing this sort of thing. And so the broader question, obviously education. And then once that happens, what are the systems that we need to look at, right, to improve, to ensure that we prevent parents from, I mean, that's horrific that a parent would do that to their child. It's just unbelievable.
Yeah. And real quick, I just want to put in there, people say, well, what does the trafficking look like? How does this happen? And one example that Tara finds in this video is a young girl, probably in her teens, and she was homeless and addicted to drugs. And that's when a man, quote unquote, takes her in, gives her a place to stay. And then eventually, to keep her, in line, gives her drugs, a place to stay, and then sells her for sex to other people, and then just keeps all the money. But she's addicted to drugs. That's her only place to stay. And so they're kind of stuck there. And so there are people out here preying on vulnerable young girls like this. And it's awful.
Yeah, I think conversation, as you were saying, Billy, is really at the center of solving this, particularly in Christian communities. I think a willingness to have these difficult conversations is necessary. One of the most powerful scenes, I think, in Sound of Freedom is when Jim Caviezel, who is obviously playing Tim Ballard, says to one of the other characters, part of the reason this proliferates so quickly and is so broadly is because this is something that's too uncomfortable for polite conversation. People don't want to hear the dark details of it. They don't want to be faced with the really grim reality of what's happening, particularly when it involves children, as it often does. People are really uncomfortable when they hear this. They don't know what to do with that information. A couple months ago, I interviewed a woman named Rue Powell. She works, she has her own organization that does anti-sex trafficking type stuff. She seeks out predators online. She has a show on Discovery Plus. And Anyway, she's not a believer, but she's talked about how she's comfortable and is willing and has gone into Christian schools, gone into churches, and said, I just want to partner with you because you have the ear of parents, right? There are parents and families who are here and are listening, and they want to know, how can I be safe online? Because this is a reality that everybody, particularly with social media, younger kids having access to smartphones or tablets or whatever it is, predators have access to kids in ways that they never have before. So if we don't have these conversations in the household, in our schools, in our churches, in our small groups, whatever, kids are going to be exposed to this content one way or another. Parents need to be leading this conversation. And what better place than in the safety of your church community?
Yeah, absolutely. And as you know, as Christians, I think we take for granted. I know at least where I am in my stage in life, you sort of take for granted the safety of your kids and the things of that nature. You sort of just assume, it can't happen to me. And I think we have to be vigilant. And I think we have to really drill down on making sure our kids know where their identity comes from, because when they start seeking it out in other places, drugs or whatever, then that's the first step. I mean, the one girl that Tara Mergener found in her report, I don't know how she got homeless, but somehow she went out looking for drugs, for some sort of security from another area other than her family, other than in God. That's where it landed her. That made her vulnerable then to being picked up into this industry. And so we have to be vigilant when it comes to letting our kids know where their true value comes from.
Yeah, and I think understanding people's stories too, right? It's really easy to see, oh, there's a drug addict, homeless person, right? Not to make excuses for behavior, but to say, how did that person get there? What was this girl's story? And that's how we fix a lot of these issues, because once you end up in a situation like trafficking, if you don't understand how somebody got there, right? It's not always, to your point, that somebody was just picked up off the side of the road and taken. There were a series of other things that happened. That helps us combat it and fight it. And this is something that Tim Ballard and others have talked a lot about, that different organizations are better for rescuing different individuals, adults, and kids based on their circumstance, right? There's different specialties and areas based on how people got where they are. And so that's a big part of it. And I would also add, understanding, a lot of people will say, well, why human trafficking? How could that happen in 2023 in the modern era? You talk about drug trafficking, these other things that, and I hate even framing it this way, but this is how it's been described to me. Drugs are a one-time use. If you traffic drugs, you make money once and that's it. Human beings, it's horrific, but they can be used again and again and again. And so we have to understand all those different facets of it in order to be able to fight it.
Yeah. Well, I was just going to say, Dan, one thing that I want to add too is you were talking about this earlier on with the way that we're targeting children, or the media and our culture is so often targeting children with this sexualization. I think part of the problem is that we've made sexuality, particularly nefarious sexuality with young teens, preteens, look appealing in some way, right? Because of the pornification, if that's a word, of our culture, we've made pornography so appealing and sexual perversion so appealing in our culture that I think it's easy to maybe dupe a 15, 16, 17-year-old boy or girl into thinking this is a really appealing way to make some money. Like, this is safe. Nobody's going to hurt me. This is a completely safe space for me to express my sexuality, when it's obviously the complete opposite of that. So often people who end up in pornography or end up in some way related, in a field related to that, right? Some sort of sex industry work, whether it's pornography or prostitution, whatever, 9 times out of 10, they were the victim of some sort of abuse in their past, or if they weren't, they become a victim of abuse. Like, this is not a safe place or a good place for anybody to be, because it goes against God's design for sexuality first and foremost. But it also is degrading. Yet we have a world that says the exact opposite, that tries to convince young teens of the exact opposite.
That's 100%. That's a great point. And you see the language, the narrative around selling yourself and prostitution. It's sex workers, and they're trying to put a positive spin on this. And you're absolutely right. It is damaging in so many ways. And from a Christian perspective, obviously, but also from just a worldly perspective, it should be. But like you said, there's a massive effort right now to twist that and to cast the sort of the narrative, and it's very damaging, very disturbing, and we need to fight against it. But we're going to take a quick break here on Faith versus Culture and continue this conversation in just a few minutes. Back in a sec. All right, we're back on this episode of Faith versus Culture, talking sound of freedom, human trafficking, and everything that goes along with it. Guys, we have time for just some final thoughts here. So, Billy, why don't you kick it off?
Yeah, I would say, for me, I think looking at all of this information, I want to make sure we're all educated, we all understand it. And for me, it was actually a reminder, this movie, that I need to be not only helping fight this, but making sure I understand the dynamics of what's happening, not only around the world, but in our own communities, in our own country. And I'd encourage all of us to be more aware.
Yeah, I think if you're a parent, obviously be proactive. Don't live in fear, right? But be aware of the situation and the reality that exists of what your kids could be exposed to or might find on the internet or among their peers. But if you're a bit older, like we were talking about with the pornography issue, if you're a bit older, know your value as a human being and know what the Word of God says about who you are, so that you don't get duped into believing these lies that you are worth selling, that you are worth, exploiting yourself, because you have a whole lot more value, a lot more God-given value than what the world wants to say.
Yeah, absolutely. And my final thought here would just be for all the keyboard warriors on social media who are criticizing Tim Ballard and his operation, I would say, how about you get off the couch and do something about it? It drives me nuts when people just sit there in their basements or wherever they're at yelling at people like Tim Ballard, who quit his job and put his own personal finances at risk to go tackle this problem because he felt so much compassion for these kids that he was seeing wrapped up in this industry. So let's stop being just so quick to throw arrows. And how about maybe we act a little bit more ourselves, and maybe the world would be a little bit better of a place. So, all right, we're going to be back to close it out on the other side of the break. This is Faith versus Culture. Back in a sec. All right, that is all the time we have for this episode of Faith versus Culture. As always, thanks so much for being here. Hope you have a fantastic week. We'll be praying for you, and we'll see you back here next time. God bless.